Hello, and welcome to the lecture on evolution and natural selection. It's my hope that this will be a review lecture for most of you. So from that point of view, I'll be covering the concepts of evolution and natural selection, but I'll be focusing on the points that I feel students are most likely to forget or are least likely to have understood in the first place. So off we go. What is evolution? If you remember from your introductory biology or anthropology courses, evolution simply means the change in a population over time. And I have two examples of evolution here. Evolution can be cultural. If we think about the population of compasses, all compasses make up a population, and we can look at the composition of this population going back to the invention of the compass. And so this is one of the original Chinese compasses, and as you can probably imagine, the composition of the populations of compasses has changed quite a bit over the last several hundred years. But of course we also can see evolution occurring in physical populations as well. And one example of this is the evolution of whales. So this is Ambulocetus. Ambulocetus is the ancestor, or one of the ancestors of modern whales, who evolved from a quadrupedal mammal and who now live full-time in the water. And we definitely can see a change in the population of whales going back, let's say, to Ambulocetus, who at least spent some time in the water. If you compare the population of Ambulocetus to the population of whales today, we see quite a few differences. We also can observe evolution occurring in another cultural population. Let's just take iPods, for example. If you look at the population of Apple products that can be loosely branched under the name iPod, we see a change over time occurring in this population. And so that's one of the things to keep in mind when we're discussing evolution, we're discussing natural selection, is that we're talking about changes within a population. Over time, we'll see descendants differ from their ancestors as a result of a variety of mechanisms, and for physical populations, that includes natural selection. So just to remind you, evolution can occur within a group. So we see here one population, over time the pink circles have gradually become purple circles, and if we can also see it occurring between groups, say a river flowed through these pink circles, we might see change occurring in different directions between the two new groups. So 4 things that I want you to know about evolution. And again, this should be a reminder for most of you, or a cautionary tale for some, because we tend to get very lazy when thinking about evolution and evolution by natural selection. So I'm going to go through these point by point. One of the first things to remember is that the pace varies. The pace of evolution varies over time. So this is an example of change in brain size over time. We might see a very long period where brain size doesn't change, where brain size is in stasis. We might see another period where there's a gradual change, a slight increase in brain size. Sometimes we see punctuated change, so a short time period where a lot of change occurs, and then we might see a period of stasis again. So the pace of evolution or change in a population over time does not have to be continual, and it can change, the pace can change depending on something that we call selection pressure. So this is one example of gradual evolution versus rapid evolution. If we go back in time 5 to 7 million years ago, we find a common ancestor for chimpanzees and humans. And the chimp-like ancestor, as I've labeled it chimp-like, is, from all of the evidence that we have, is relatively similar, or at least more similar to modern chimpanzee populations than the ancestor is to modern human populations. So we infer from this that there has been a gradual evolution in chimpanzee populations, pretty similar brain size, use of quadrupedal locomotion and brachiation. And when you compare the chimp-like ancestor to modern human populations, we see drastic increases in brain size, drastic changes in cooperative abilities, and locomotion like bipedality. So just keep in mind that just because the same amount of time has passed between two species and their ancestors, the rate of change might have varied between species and the ancestor population. The other thing to keep in mind is that the direction of change varies, and the direction of change does not include any value. So this is a comparison of the change in brain size between human evolutionary history and male bonobo evolutionary history. And we see that human brain size has increased over the last 4 million years, and brain size for male bonobos has actually decreased in size over the last 4 million years. So evolution is occurring in each of these populations. We've seen a change in population over time, but the direction has varied, and we don't say that humans are more evolved and male bonobos are less evolved. We just say that the direction of change has been different in these two species. And we can say that without referring to a mechanism. Of course, we're going to be making a lot of arguments regarding natural selection in this class, but keep in mind there are other mechanisms such as genetic drift that can result in changes like these also. And just to show you a picture, to remind you that evolution is not linear, we see here on the left the old view at the bottom, 1935 museum display, and you see this on t-shirts all the time, of a chimp-like ancestor gradually standing upright to become human. It's a very linear idea of evolution, often resulting in this shining goal or example of perfection, which is humans, and we know that's not the case because the pace of evolution varies and the direction varies. We'd like to think of evolution as much more of a branching occurrence. So changes occurring in many different directions, in many different, at many different speeds, and definitely not from a less evolved species to a more evolved species or a less evolved population to a more evolved population. Which leads us to point number 3. A major cause of evolution is environmental change. I'm going to discuss natural selection in depth in a few slides, but just to remind you, when we look at how a population has changed over time in the past, we can often see that these changes mirror selection pressures in the environment. So an environment has changed. Now, some individuals are more successful than others. The successful individuals will leave behind descendants. So for human bipedality, we have a pretty good idea that climate change drove differences in locomotion between humans and our chimp-like ancestors. The current model is that some type of climate change occurred. There was a cooling and a drying of the Earth's environment, possibly around 6 million years ago. This led to a reduction in forest cover, fewer trees, and chimp-like ancestors could not move between the trees by climbing anymore, so we hypothesize that our ancestors had to find a new way of locomoting between patches, and bipedality, or walking on 2 legs, was more efficient. So we see how a change in climate has driven a change in phenotype or expression of a characteristic such as bipedality within this population. So we have to keep in mind that we're always looking backwards when we're talking about evolution, and especially when we're talking about evolution by natural selection. So we're oftentimes looking at past environments and how those are connected with changes in the characteristics within populations. And finally, this is my main caution to students, is that evolution is not goal-driven. Oops, I forgot to change the other text in this slide. So ignore those bullet points for a second, they'll be on the next slide. My point about evolution not being goal-driven is never talk about evolution as if it's a person. If you catch yourself talking about evolution as evolution did this, or a species evolved to do this, it's very easy to slip into these mannerisms, and please catch me during class. I try not to speak this way. It implies that there's a goal. Humans evolved to be bipedal, and I probably made a mistake and said it like that earlier. A better way to say that would be bipedality is a result of evolution by natural selection. So try not to think of evolution as achieving an ends. Try not to think of evolution as going forward in time. An ancestral population evolved to be this way. Rather, think of the current population and look backwards in time, and that way you'll avoid saying evolution is goal-driven. And by this I mean look backwards in time at the ancestors that were successful or left more of their genetic material for one reason or another. I'm going to go through this a little more towards the end of the lecture. So let's look at those bullet points now. I also just wanted to remind you really quick that similarities between species can happen in two ways. So we can see a similarity between species occurring as a result of their shared evolutionary history, and we call this homology. But remember that we can also see similarities happening because different groups have had similar solutions to similar problems, and that's what we call homoplasy. So let's have a slide on each of these. Homology, shared evolutionary history. One example that we possibly see homology acting in is the way that male primates group together and especially defend territories with one another. So chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans, we often see male groups forming coalitions to defend a resource or a group of other individuals, but we don't see this same type of social organization in gorillas and orangutans. So one explanation for the fact that we see male groups in chimpanzees and bonobos and humans is that we have a shared evolutionary history. And this is similar to the phylogeny explanation in terms of levels of explanation. We can say, why are males acting this way? Well, it's a result of shared ancestry. Homoplasy is when two groups are similar in terms of either biology, physiology, or behavior. This goes for both homology and homoplasy. But in this case, they've had to solve similar problems. And here the problem is that you have a delicious mound of termites, but they live inside a tree or a dirt mound or somewhere inaccessible to you. Crows have managed to solve this problem by becoming tool users. I just caught myself. Please be aware of the way you speak in the same way. A better way to say that would be crows can use tools as a result of ancestors successfully solving this problem. So crow populations have changed over time, and crows can currently use tools because their ancestors were successful at using them to extract termites from termite mounds. So in this case, the crow has a stick. It puts the stick inside the hollow tree where there are termites. The termites see the fresh wood and chomp onto the stick, and the crow will pull the stick out and peck the termites off. Chimpanzees have figured out how to do the same thing. Current chimpanzee populations have ancestors who were able to use tools to solve this problem also. It may seem a little confusing to start thinking of evolution differently than you may have done in the past, but trust me, it will lead to a lot of clarity when it comes to trying to understand evolution by natural selection, and also when you try to talk about it with other people. Okay, so just a reminder, before we start talking about natural selection, there are actually 4 forces of evolution, 4 mechanisms that can cause change within a population over time. And let's just specifically start talking about the composition of alleles in a population. So we might see a change in height genes, we might see more tall alleles being present over time, or we might see more short alleles being present over time. One way this can happen is with mutation. Something happens within the genetic code of several individuals where their short alleles mutate into tall alleles, or tall alleles mutate into short alleles, and that changes the frequency of these different expressions of the gene, which we'll see as a change in phenotype. So we might get a change in the population due to mutation. I'll skip over natural selection because we're going to talk about that. We might also see a change in the composition of a population over time due to gene flow. And the short word for gene flow is migration. So individuals from another population have migrated into your population, bringing with them different alleles, new genes, and this causes a change in the genetic composition in your population because you now have new genes or new alleles coming in from outside. And don't forget about genetic drift. So genetic drift, occurs more strongly in small populations, and I like to think of the spaceship analogy for genetic drift. So if we had to choose a small sample of the human population to get on a spaceship and another smaller sample of the human population to start a colony, the composition of the colony would probably differ from the composition of the human gene pool back on Earth, because you've taken a sample of a sample, and each time you're not getting exactly the same proportion of genes and alleles as you had in your original population. So sometimes you just get the composition of genes and alleles within a population changing over time due to random events like lightning strikes or population shrinking, and some people randomly survive and some don't. Okay, let's talk about natural selection now. If you would like more review on all of these concepts, I am more than happy to talk with you in office hours or suggest some fun, yet interesting, yet informative readings if you feel you need to brush up some more. So, this is a part of my lecture on natural selection that I call Why the World Isn't Full of Bunnies. And it's drawn from a commercial that I cannot find on the internet, where a man and his granddaughter go into a pet shop to buy some rabbits, and he's taking so long to write his checks that in the meantime the rabbits are multiplying and multiplying in their cages and filling up around their ears within the pet shop. So you can imagine, let's start with generation 1. We'll be conservative and say each generation the number of bunnies in the population are going to double. So generation 2 we have 2, then 4, 8, 16 in generation 5, 32 in generation, or 64 in generation 7. In generation 20, you'd have over 1 million bunnies. By 100 generations, you'd have, I don't even know what this number is, amount of bunnies. And that's not that much time. Let's say there's a 2-year generational difference between rabbits, one to grow, and then you can reproduce. So 100 generations is only 200 years, and there are, if every bunny was surviving and reproducing, the world would literally be full of bunnies, because that's a lot of bunnies. So our question is, why isn't the world full of bunnies? And the answer is because resources are finite. Resources include things like food, water, space, air. And because these resources are finite, that means that there's competition. If bunnies could grow infinitely and resources remain finite, eventually you're going to exceed the amount of resources that can support the number of bunnies in the world. So that means that some bunnies are going to make it and some aren't. So there's going to be competition between bunnies for available resources like food, water, and space. So what causes who wins and who doesn't? Well, this comes from the fact that there is variation in phenotypes in a population. So phenotypes are expressed characteristics of genes. One example is height. It could be tooth length, metabolic rate, any way that genes express themselves in physical characteristics and behaviors we refer to as phenotypes. And just looking at any population of bunnies, you can immediately see that there is variation in phenotypes within populations. And some bunnies will have traits that allow them to survive and allow them to reproduce more often than bunnies without those traits. So there's competition, there's variation, and this variation means that due to differences in phenotype, some bunnies will get access to resources, be able to survive, be able to reproduce. Some bunnies won't. And we cannot forget the last point here. Some of the variation is heritable. And this is the key to remember. If the variation is not heritable, meaning you can't pass on the advantage that you had, it's not tied to any sort of inheritance mechanism like DNA, then we won't be able to see changes in the genetic composition of the population. So in prose, that's if these more successful bunnies pass on their traits to the kids will also be more successful. And this means that over time, the more successful bunnies will outcompete those without the advantageous traits. So those are the 3 main points that you have to remember when you're thinking about evolution by natural selection. There's competition, there's variation, and that variation is heritable, so that the individuals who are better able to compete will pass on the characteristics that make them more successful. And over time, we'd see a change in the composition of the population to include more of those individuals with the successful traits and less of those individuals without the successful traits. So here's another example. Just remember, there's always more organisms produced than can survive. And variation in phenotypes exists. So here we see two parents, and they have a mixture of tall and short alleles. Some of their offspring got more of the tall alleles, some of the offspring got more of the short alleles, and a lot of the offspring got a mix of tall and short. So we see a variation in phenotypes, and these are heritable phenotypes. So some organisms end up with a phenotype more suited to their environment than others. In this case, the individuals with the tall alleles are closer to the food, they can get more calories, they have a larger energy budget to do things like run away from predators, find mates, fight off diseases, that kind of thing. And we know that organisms with the favorable phenotypes, depending on the environment, are more likely to survive and reproduce. So over time, we expect to see the population will change to increase in the number of individuals with favorable phenotypes and decrease the number of individuals with non-favorable phenotypes. And remember, this is totally dependent on what is increasing competition. In this case, competition for food is totally driven by height. Taller individuals in this environment get more food. If the environment was different, say all the food was growing on the ground, the shorter individuals might have been more successful at competing than the taller individuals. And so we would expect to see evolution occurring in the opposite direction with an increase of short alleles. But because the environment has the fruit hanging from the ceiling, this is a pattern that we observe. And what we call the results of this process are adaptations. Adaptations are defined as changes in physical structure, function, or behavior that promote survival and reproduction in a given environment. So keep in mind that when we're talking about evolution by natural selection, we have to think of two things happening. Individuals have to survive, especially to survive to reproductive age, and they also have to have kids. If there's no heritability, if there's no inheritance of traits, no reproduction occurring for a certain genotype, that genotype will not exist in future generations. Another way of saying that would be ancestors in the past who are not as successful. Let's say our great-great-grandparents that didn't have any kids won't have any descendants in the population today. So adaptations are always, we think of as a result of the process of natural selection. The increase of adaptive traits in a population is what we expect to see when evolution by natural selection is occurring. So just some more common misconceptions that I want to go through. There's a lot of cultural baggage surrounding the term evolution. So we just need to keep in mind that evolution does not explain the origins of life. Remember, variation, competition, and inheritance. There's nothing about where life came from. So once we get a population with variation, where individuals have to compete and their success is heritable, then we expect to see evolution by natural selection occurring. It doesn't explain anything about the origins of life. Evolution is also not for the good of the species. This is an idea that came around in the 50s and 60s, and biologists would see these huge flocks of birds, for example, and they would go and they would look in their nests, and they would notice that many birds were raising fewer chicks than they possibly could. And the hypothesis was that these individuals are flocking to kind of count their numbers, keep track of how many new babies the group could support, and restrain their reproduction to avoid overpopulation. But remember, evolution is defined as change within a population over time. So we're looking at the population of birds in this case. We're looking at how the composition of that population changes based on success of certain individuals. So some individuals are more successful, some individuals are less successful. They're all competing with one another, and we see this change occurring within a population as some individuals have left more descendants than others. So we're never talking about evolution for the good of the species or for the good of the population. And we'll discuss a special case at the end of class, but we need to understand a little bit more about evolution and natural selection first so you don't get confused. Just think of evolution occurring within a population based on individual survival and reproductive success. And those individuals who are more successful at surviving and reproducing will leave more descendants behind. And this is just showing you an example of reproductive restraint, why it looks like birds might be laying fewer eggs than they could, but how it actually makes sense from the point of view of the individual. So if you look at these curves of adult mortality and the percentage of brood surviving, we see that the greatest gap between how likely the children are to survive and how likely the parents are to die while taking care of these birds occurs right here, and this is in fact the most common number of offspring. And what's happening is in this population, some birds will have too many babies. They'll have, let's say, 15 eggs laid. What happens often in this case when this does occur is that the young don't get fed enough, and so they're very weak, and the parents are exhausted or predated upon because they're out foraging so much trying to support all these chicks. So if you have too many babies, you actually will leave fewer offspring. However, if you have too few babies, we see that the parents' genes are not as likely to be represented in the future generation. So a lot of times we see what looks like reproductive restraint is actually a successful strategy for the good of the individual that actually makes them more competitive when it comes to rearing enough chicks and enough chicks with enough quality that they can survive and reproduce themselves. And that's a reminder to me to tell you about evolutionary trade-offs. We're going to talk about these a lot in class, and that's because evolution is almost always a trade-off. Time and resources are limited. So individuals trying to maximize survival and lifetime fitness often have to compromise. In this case, you can think of, you might have fewer higher quality offspring instead of many lower quality offspring. However, you want to balance these, right? We also see trade-offs between foraging effort and reproductive effort, and trade-offs between trying to find mates and trying to spend time parenting. So we will discuss evolutionary trade-offs a lot more in future lectures. Evolution, another misconception of evolution is that it's a perfection of form, and oftentimes humans put themselves at the top of the ladder. But remember, there's no goal, there's no direction in evolution. There's not, oops, wrong way. A foreseeable future. There's not we cannot predict the future. So therefore we cannot attempt to breed offspring that will be successful in that future. Also, with all of the evolutionary trade-offs that occur, it's very difficult to achieve whatever one would define as perfection of form. Pigs won't fly. There's too many constraints occurring. And we also don't know how the environment will change, and the traits that make individuals successful are dependent on the problems that they have to solve in their environment. So remember, adaptations are always the result of a process, not the end goal. One of my favorite misconceptions, just because I like this cartoon, is that natural selection does not give organisms what they need. Constraints matter. Beavers are not able to process diesel fuel or produce metal components, so they will never be able to have chainsaws for arms, no matter how much they might need a chainsaw arm. We have to keep in mind constraints, and we have to keep in mind that we're only seeing the current step of a process. The environment might change, a change within a population will continue occurring. So natural selection does not and cannot give organisms what they need. At the same time, evolution is not random. Mutation is random. The generation of new alleles is random, but there's non-random retention. So we call this selective retention, and that's dependent on the environment. So mutation can produce new variations within a population. Some of these variations help individuals be successful. Most of them, in fact, probably decrease the competitiveness of individuals. And the ones that increase your ability to find food mates, leave behind genetic material, is a result of the selective retention of these new variations that increase your competitive ability. Also, please never ever let me hear you say that organisms try to adapt or want to adapt to a circumstance. Natural selection is not a deus ex machina. And so, like I said, don't talk about evolution like a person. I would say a lot of times I hear students talking about natural selection as if it were a god almost. Natural selection doesn't do things for species, and species or populations cannot consciously drive the process of natural selection. So individuals cannot, even if we could foresee the future, it would be very difficult to try to change the genetic composition of a population to increase the competitiveness of individuals for that potential future. Finally, evolution by natural selection is not about the survival of the fittest. First of all, this is misleading because both survival and reproduction are important. Survival of the fittest often implies survival alone, and when we say fit, we have to consciously remind ourselves that we're talking about fit to the environment, not just necessarily big and strong and fast. Sometimes being fit means being slower, being smaller, being more concealed. Whatever traits have given a competitive advantage in the past. So remember that evolution and natural selection is a very simplistic concept, competition, variation, inheritance, that deserves a lot of complex and conscious thought. And it has taken me, probably about 10 years to really feel like I start understanding evolution by natural selection. And it doesn't mean that it'll take you that long. I'm just saying be conscious about how you think about this process. And if you do that, then I'll be very pleased. So that is the end of the lecture. I hope you have enjoyed it, and please email me or talk to me in class if you have any questions, and I'll be happy to discuss these concepts further. So long for now.